basically here. I never learned any of this. So to the best of your knowledge, has that changed at all? What is taught about this, or is it taught at all if you're growing up now?
That's a good question. I don't think so. I mean, I think it obviously is going to depend on who your teacher is, and I know there's a documentary coming out next year that's seeking to be used in classrooms, talking about some of these struggles. I'm a little talking head in there. But I think, you know, when you look at like a U.S. history textbook, you talk about the West and like the Oregon Trail, you talk about relations between the U.S. and government and indigenous people, you talk about like, you know, settler colonialism in some ways, but labor you talk about in a different, you know, in a different chapter when you're looking at like Chicago and New York. And so I don't think that it's really like the way we segment the way that history is looked at. I don't think that we really get there, at least in elementary schools. But it's gonna, you know, it's gonna depend where you are. But I think labor history is, you know, is something that's not taught very often, and those kind of things, stories really are left out.
Is there any person that you set out to find more about that you weren't able to find, you know, going through all of your research and all the different places that you've been looking for?
There were a lot of them. I mean,
Yeah.
really, there's maybe the two women that I have chapters on that focus more on them, on Louisa Livero and Marie Equi, because somebody else from Oregon State University Press wrote a book about Marie Equi, so he found her beginning to end story. But a lot of the other women were just, you know, I pick up their trails and then they're gone. Especially one of them, Edith Frenette, was kind of part of my inspiration and telling these stories. And I can't find her after 1917. And I know she had separated from her husband around that time. So again, that whole married name thing, who knows? Did she marry someone else, have a different name? I can't find her, you know? And so there's a lot of that. There's a lot of stories that were just like Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Smith, you know? Okay, can't really do much of that. So yeah.
Did you conclude or did you come to any conclusions about what impact their activities had on us today, or?
I think there's a lot of different impacts. I think sometimes not necessarily what they set out to be. Like, if you look at the Spokane free speech fight, which was in 1909, it was one of the, you know, the first really big free speech fights of the Union. And what a free speech fight was basically where there would be some kind of ordinance that says you can't speak in the street, and the Wilders would fight that, because that's how they organized people, was street speaking. And so they would say, everybody, you know, come speak on the street, we're gonna get arrested, we're gonna fill up the jails, see, you know, how much they can take. And so some people argue that the free speech fight was a failure because they didn't, you know, have long-term changes on the conditions of working, of the job sharks and the way people were organized in Spokane. But because of the publications of the women who were jailed in Spokane, they had their first ever female matron in the city jail. So again, that's not what they set out to do, but it was, you know, it was an impact. I think the same thing of the birth control activism, you know, like those are things that have real tangible benefits in people's lives that they can, you know, appreciate. So I think less in the way of like continued organization and more in some of those kind of smaller, more intangible ways.
I really enjoyed your talk, Heather, and I'm just wondering, did you have like a thesis when you started the book and follow through the thesis, or was it more of a discovery kind of a study, or just curious?
It was more of a discovery. I mean, I started out I did a paper during my master's about how women were represented in IWW newspapers. So I kind of had some of those ideas of like, all right, they talk about, you know, there's the rebel girl, who is kind of the, you know, she's the woman out there on the front lines, you know, that's the cover of the book, the rebel girl. But then there was also talk a lot about women in kind of motherly roles, in motherly ways, and there's the fallen prostitute kind of thing, so I talked about it in that way. But the rest of it was a lot of just kind of discovering as I went through, and kind of making that connection of how IWW women were looked at, talked about their respectability, their status as married or unmarried women, whether they believed in free love or not. All these things in court cases were brought up, you know, that had nothing to do with what the trial was about. So I started to kind of see those patterns emerging, and then again how activism kind of changed as the U.S. entered the war.
How do you think your research should
change our notions of the IWW? Somebody else had.
I think, and it's one of the things that, you know, my advisor had mentioned before, like, there's not really the IWW, you know, like many IWWs, you know, so I think I think it really should change our understanding of how the union functioned as part of the radical community, in different areas. And I mean, we get some of that when we look at places like, you know, Lawrence and look specifically at those strikes, but looking at kind of a bigger picture of how people, you know, were traveling between, you know, Everett and Spokane and Seattle, and it wasn't just, you know, men who were riding the trains, it was men and women. You know, there were wives of organizers who, a lot of these organizers had wives who were arrested with them. You know, again, they're never mentioned. So I think it really broadens our scope of how the union functioned as part of the radical community.
Did you get a sense of, were the women mainly married who were in this, mainly single, and then the wives that were the fellow travelers?
I think a lot of them were married that I could find out about. Like when you look at the, you know, the Oregon Packing Company strike, there, you know, the women workers there, a lot of them were young women, but you know, they ranged in ages from teenagers up into their 50s. But a lot of the more active women were married, or even like in one case got married like the day before the trial to their long-term partner because they knew they were going to be asked about whether or not they were really, you know, legally able to cohabitate together. So I did a lot of the ones that popped up more often were married, but like I said, Edith Burnett, you know, when she testifies during a trial, they're like, "Where's your husband?" Well, he's back in Canada, and I don't live with him anymore. You know, where's your home? Do you live with this man? Were you in a rooming house with this man? So, you know, some were separated, but a lot of them were, you know, were married. I think much more than we normally think of when it comes to the union.
Did you ever get depressed thinking of the sort of today and then 100 years ago with the notion that like the IWW ties to anarchism as a philosophy and as a practice? Today it's meaningless to almost everyone, and it's just the kid who doesn't know any better, or it's someone who's going to break a window, instead of being it's the people who helped organize us, it's the people who are in jail because of speaking out against the war. So to me it seems like when I study that era, it's like their sense of radical politics was more felt, and today that feels, you know, we'd be more satisfied with Barack. And I feel like 100 years ago, they'd be shouting down Obama as an imperialist, rightfully so.
Well, I mean, you're right. They definitely looked at, you know, I mean, when you look at like the Mr. Block cartoons, and they have the one about, you know, Mr. Block's kind of this cartoon character, and he's, you know, happy-go-lucky guy, and he's, you know, kind of dumb, and they make fun of him. But, you know, he votes for a socialist mayor, you know, and then they show all the bad things that the socialist police officers are doing to him, and all of that. And I think, but some of those struggles were there too. The kind of, you know, the squabbling and the political stuff definitely also was revealed. Like as in the case of Louisa Libero, who was a member of the union, she worked for the union, was a stenographer, but she was also openly an anarchist. And these letters of her friends, when they're trying to figure out how to defend her, are, you know, well, she's an anarchist. We don't want to associate with an anarchist, you know. And so there's a lot of that kind of squabbling there as well. But I mean, it is depressing to think of, you know, 100 years ago and like, seriously, you know, we're still dealing with all this stuff. But I also, you know, again, for the Wobblies that I study, some of them were around for the, you know, the 1930s and that rise of industrial unionism. A lot of them weren't, you know, and you don't always get to see, you know, kind of the later fruition of some of this activism, I guess. But yeah, it's heartening and depressing at the same time to look at, you know, all these people who did all this stuff, look at how they were still fighting with one another and couldn't agree on things, but also look at like the impacts that they had. So.
Just talking about the book, researching it, how you had to go from just a little bit of a story and then follow that, you know, you said the Wayne State, and then try to research all these papers and find just a little bit of this to then maybe send you on another point. Was there any point during that, I'm sure there were dead ends, but was there any one point where it's like, finally, I get this entire story, like that stood out more than any other one?
I think the biggest one was when I got the immigration records for Becky Beck, because again, I just had newspaper records. And the other thing that's really fun about doing this research is that newspapers all spell the names differently, so you don't, you're just kind of guessing about how to find these people and what their names might have actually been. But I think when I was able to, because it had this whole, it was depositions, it had a petition that was signed by like 700 people, like that was like, okay, here's a thing, like here's a real thing. And there's a lot of dead ends. It's like, when I say it's like putting together a puzzle, it's like a puzzle with missing pieces and then a whole bunch of other pieces from different puzzles thrown in, and you gotta kind of like, all right, this one looks really pretty, but it does not fit here, and so I'm gonna have to set it aside. So there's a lot of that. In my research, it's just, the initial research is a bunch of one sentence mentions of women, basically, and then trying to build stories around that.
Was there any marked difference between the activists in Washington versus Oregon, or did they tend to travel from town to town?
There was some traveling, but the most part, much of the activism happened in Washington. It was much more kind of radical overall than Oregon was. Like, I wasn't able, there was a few mentions of other things outside of Portland, but not a lot. So for the most part, you see more continuity of travel between like Spokane and Seattle of the same people, and Tacoma, those names pop up a lot more often, so it was. And Carrie will be interested in this. I was originally including BC, but I wasn't able to really, again, it was a couple sentences, and I wasn't able to find enough threads to pull to make it a truly transnational story. But that was my original attempt, was going to include that.
Appreciate it.
Sort of with 1924, is there any plans to continue Wobblies after 1924 into the Depression and into later years?
I don't know.
Too much right now.
Again, for the women that I study, a lot of people were really disillusioned in the early 20s. Like, Louisa Livero apparently married a conservative guy and moved to California and never talked to her friends again. Which is, those aren't the endings you want to see. Those are the depressing endings. But it was a really tough time period, especially for people who went to jail for speaking out against a war that they couldn't stop, that cost millions of lives, that didn't change anything. And then they leave jail, and you're kind of in this weird conservative political climate in the early 1920s, so it was kind of depressing, for them. And so there's not a lot of stories that I can pull through, but there were, the Wobblies continued, and there were like junior Wobblies in the 1930s where they, the young recruits and had their own paper and everything. So there are some kind of threads to pull on in a couple other decades.
I was wondering about that time period of 1918, the dominant immigrant groups that were in the Northwest at that time, that were the IWW was trying to organize.
Yeah, so when you look at, one of the things I found interesting when I was actually looking at census records is that Oregon and Washington had a much higher immigrant population than many other states, which you're like, well, seems weird. Mostly because people coming from Canada. So it's not exactly as diverse of an immigrant population as you would think. But the European immigrants were primarily Scandinavians, Finns, Norwegians, Swedish people. Those were one of the larger immigrant groups that the IWW was organizing. There were, of course, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino workers in the Northwest. In the strikes that I studied, I did not see a lot of direct outreach or organization of those groups, but they were definitely there. So you see, a large immigrant population, but it does primarily Northwestern European or Canadian immigrants. And a friend of mine also does research on Wobblies in the Northwest, and his book is about the Grace Harbor region, and he actually looks at the Finnish language newspaper sources, and so it kind of tells the story of the men and women involved in the union there. So I only read English, and therefore my sources are confined to those ones, but they weren't doing a ton of international organizing in the Northwest.
What were some of your more unusual sources?
A lot of the sources came from official records, like police reports or spy reports, which is one of the, spy reports are hard to read because you're not a very good spy if you're never finding anything. And so, who knows? They're talking about this pie that was delivered to men in jail, and that pie seems awfully suspicious, So, you gotta look at some of these things. and kind of take them with with a grain of salt. There's some great stuff at the University of Washington archives where I got to read the correspondence between Louisa Livero and her friend Minnie Reimer, who was her kind of most steadfast ally while she was in jail. So that was really great to be able to read that firsthand. But for most of the women I studied, I don't get to hear their voices directly. They didn't give speeches, they didn't write autobiographies, so it's really left with what other people had to say about them. And that comes up when I write about the Spokane free speech fight, and there's this whole thing about they were, doing, because of the women's activism, they were researching conditions in the women's jail. And so there's these interviews with every social worker, police officer, anybody who was working in these jails. And they start talking about how these two wobbly women were how this other, one of them was making fun of the other one and didn't believe her or didn't like her. So I'm like, how do I interpret this? Again, these are people who have an interest in discrediting these people, but a whole bunch of them are saying it. Maybe she was annoyed by her. I mean, nobody has to get along all the time. I don't know. But you have to kind of interpret from some of those things. And it's unfortunate that, a lot of their voices just aren't there. And I tell my students when they try to say, history is written by the victors, I'm like, history is written by the people who can write and who leave records and who people deem those records to be important enough to keep around, So these voices we often have to parse out from other people who have an interest in suppressing them. So it was difficult. It was a lot of small things here and there, but most of them came from official sources.
Did you see any significant correspondence between the women in the Pacific Northwest and other, I'm thinking of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, or just other women radicals at the time, like Emma Goldman? Did those networks exist, and did they exist as women radical networks, or were they just part of the larger radical networks?
That's a good question. It's interesting when you look at some of the recollections and see kind of how the women talk about each other and how, I don't know if they necessarily, again, they very much felt like class interests were more important than female interests. But Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was here. She was in the Northwest organizing. She lived with Marie Equity during the 1920s. And, the story she tells in her autobiography is very different than what her biographers have said about, their relationship and their friendship and all of that. And Emma Goldman, was around, and they were doing some kind of joint picnics or joint talks, but then she would say in her autobiography about how the Wobblies weren't supporting her when she was involved in a free speech fight. So, again, I think it's like any human network. There's times when they came together, and there's times where they disagreed.
I know somebody was talking about whether or not these types of subject matter are taught in schools. What is your greatest hope that you attach to the work that you've done, and how it will impact people if these kinds of subjects are taught?
That's a great question. My hope is for people to learn about the history of radical activism, and that it is, it's individuals taking risks and making choices every day about their lives. It's not just the people who give up everything to organize a movement or to go to jail. That it's really about everyday people finding their voices and finding their power in community. And that's what I hope people ultimately gain from it. That seems like a good ending.
Yes.